The air was thick with salt that August evening in 2020. What began as a routine demolition would soon become the key to unlocking one of Hawaii's oldest mysteries. When a worker's hammer struck hollow ground beneath the shed floor, the echo was different. A few strikes later, the concrete broke open, revealing a rusted metal box, sealed and heavy with time. As the box was pried open, the scent of seaweed and corroded iron rose through the humid air. Inside lay a pearl necklace dulled by age, a set of medical forms from 1979, and a faded Polaroid photo showing a young woman beside a man in a security uniform, the sea glimmering faintly behind them. The faint writing on the photograph carried a name that had once haunted the town: Leilani Akana, an art teacher, a mother, and a woman who had vanished during the Great Kona storm of 1980. The workers did not know it then, but the moment the box saw daylight, a silence buried for 4 decades began to stir. For years, the people of Hilo had whispered that the ocean took her. But what if it had not? What if the storm was not nature's doing, but a veil hiding a far darker truth? How did a woman disappear without a trace on the morning before the storm? And why did her husband, who claimed she was lost to the sea, bury a box of her belongings beneath his own home? If you want to uncover the answers to these questions, then pause for a moment, like this video, and subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next episode of this haunting story, and tell us from which city you are watching this cold case. Let us reach 5,000 likes on this story so that Leilani's truth can be heard once again. The night the box was found, the demolition site became a crime scene. Officers marked the perimeter, their flashlight beams reflecting off the wet earth as rain began to fall once more, echoing the storm that had once erased a life. The evidence inside the box was sent to the Honolulu Police Department's cold case unit for examination. When Lieutenant Ava Kimura received the initial report, she paused at the name. Leilani Akana, a missing teacher. Case number 80-112. To many, it was a forgotten file buried under dust. But for Ava, it was the beginning of something that would shake Hawaii's justice system to its core. Because what seemed like a storm's tragedy in 1980 was about to reveal a secret that had been hidden under layers of concrete, silence, and time. The island that had once whispered of waves and wind would now speak of deceit, buried truth, and justice delayed but never denied. August 12, 1980. The first gusts of Tropical Storm Kona swept through Hilo's narrow streets as dawn light shimmered faintly over the restless sea. The air was heavy and warm, the kind that pressed against the skin like a warning. Palm trees bent with the growing wind, and far in the distance, thunder rolled across the Pacific like a slow drum. Inside a small wooden house near the edge of Waiākea, Leilani Akana stood by the window tying her hair back. She was 28, an art teacher at Waiākea High School, known for her calm voice and quiet smile. That morning, she was running late, trying to finish packing a folder of student drawings she wanted to grade before the storm arrived. She slipped on her beige raincoat, tucked the folder under her arm, and kissed her sleeping daughter on the forehead before stepping out onto the damp porch. Neighbors saw her wave as she crossed the yard and walked toward her brown Toyota Corolla parked near the road. The wind was beginning to rise, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and coming rain. She called out to a local fisherman tying his boat, saying she would stop by the school and return early before the storm grew worse. No one knew those would be her last words heard in the daylight. By noon, heavy rain blanketed the coastline. The radio warned residents to stay inside, bridges were flooding, and the sky turned the color of steel. At Waiākea High School, the front office called Leilani's home to ask why she had not arrived. The line rang once, then went silent. Hours passed. The wind howled through the palms, and still no sign of her. Back at the small house, her husband, Kimo Ana, sat by the window watching the rain hit the glass in rhythmic streaks. He later told police that he believed she had stayed at the school to wait out the storm. He said he was not worried, not yet. But by morning, when the storm had moved inland and the sea pounded against the breakwall, Leilani was gone. The next day, at 8:17 a.m., Kimo called the Hilo Police Department. His voice was calm as he reported that his wife had not returned home and might have been swept away by floodwaters. The duty officer on shift logged the report without hesitation. Female, 28 years old, last seen driving a brown Toyota Corolla. Missing during severe weather conditions. Case file opened, classification, missing person. Outside, the storm showed no mercy. Streets were flooded, waves broke against the seawall, and the town waited in silence, unsure whether Leilani had been taken by the storm or by something far more human. The island had seen many storms before, but this one carried something different in its wind. A silence that did not feel like nature's work. Somewhere between the rain and the tide, a truth was already beginning to sink beneath the surface. And when the search began the next morning, the storm would not be the only thing leaving its marks on Hilo's shores. The rain had not stopped. It came in long, sweeping bursts that blurred the world into shades of gray and silver. The morning after Leilani's disappearance, Hilo woke under a sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the town itself. Inside the police station, the smell of damp paper and salt water filled the air as Chief William Lau studied the report placed before him. Missing person, female, 28, last seen before the storm. He frowned, tapping the paper with a calloused finger. Then he looked up at his young lieutenant. Kaleo Tanaka, sharp-eyed and calm under pressure, had worked through the night answering storm calls. When the chief handed him the file, his words were short. Start the search. Treat it as urgent. Every hour matters. By dawn, 2 patrol cars and a volunteer rescue truck were already crawling along Route 19, the coastal road that connected Hilo's northern neighborhoods to Waiākea High School. The storm had chewed at the edges of the road, flooding low dips with thick brown water. Branches and debris littered the shoulders and power lines sagged under the weight of wind. The rescuers moved slowly, headlights cutting through the mist like thin blades of light. At Waiākea Bridge, an officer shouted over the roar of the river. Faint tire tracks appeared in the mud near the guardrail. They led toward the water, then vanished. The men stood staring at the marks, rain dripping from their helmets, each silently asking the same question. Did she drive straight into the flood, or was she forced there? They photographed the scene carefully, marking the coordinates with wooden stakes before the rising tide erased it all. The brown current below churned and foamed, carrying fragments of palm fronds and plastic bottles toward the sea. The sound was deafening, like the island itself breathing. Chief Lawo arrived shortly after, his raincoat flapping in the wind. He shouted to Tanaka over the storm. If she was swept away, the body should drift south. Notify the Coast Guard. By mid-morning, a helicopter circled above the coastline, its spotlight cutting across the violent waves. Visibility was poor. Every time the pilot dipped lower, the rain sheeted over the glass, turning the sea below into a blur of movement. Through static, his voice crackled over the radio. Nothing visible. No car, no wreckage. The storm is too thick. Back on land, officers combed the roadside ditches and drainage canals, prodding with long poles for any sign of debris. They found only broken branches, mud, and the faint echo of the sea. By afternoon, the rain eased slightly, leaving behind a hollow silence. The team regrouped at the station, soaked and exhausted. Chief Lawo studied the day's findings pinned to the board. Maps, photos of tire tracks, and a blank report labeled evidence pending. No witnesses, no car, no proof. He leaned over the desk, the light flickering above him. The only trace they had were those fading tracks leading to water, and even they were already dissolving in the rain. He whispered under his breath as if to himself. If she was taken by the storm, the sea will return her. If not, someone made sure it never would. Outside, thunder rolled far off across the bay, and the wind carried the scent of salt and earth. Somewhere beyond the flooded road and the dark water, The truth waited, half buried under the storm's noise, daring to be found. Rain still fell in gentle streaks across the windows of the Hilo police station when Kimo Ana arrived that afternoon. He walked in slowly, his shirt damp at the shoulders, his face pale and unreadable. Lieutenant Kaleo Tanaka watched him from across the room, noticing how calm the man appeared for someone whose wife had just vanished. Kimo removed his wet cap, placed it neatly on the table, and sat down when asked. Tanaka started the recorder, his voice steady but curious. He asked Kimo to describe his wife's last morning. Kimo spoke softly, eyes fixed on the table. He said that Leilani left home around 6:30, wearing her beige raincoat and carrying her folder of art papers. He told them he stayed behind because he had a fever. The power went out soon after, and when she did not return by nightfall, he assumed she had stayed at the school for safety. His tone never changed. His hands did not shake. There were no tears, no tremor in his voice. Every answer came too smooth, too measured, as if he had practiced each line before walking through the door. Tanaka leaned back in his chair and studied the man. Something about the stillness in his eyes unsettled him. Grief usually came in waves, anger, fear, denial, but Kimo's calm was like stone. Later that evening, while Tanaka reviewed his notes, a knock came at his office door. An older woman stood there clutching a worn umbrella. She introduced herself as Ruth Kawano, the Ana's next-door neighbor. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. She said she had heard loud voices the night before the storm. A woman crying, a man shouting. She thought it was just a small argument, but then the crying stopped suddenly. Ruth looked down at her hands and whispered that she had not seen Leilani since. Tanaka thanked her, wrote down every word, and stared at the clock ticking on the wall. The storm outside had quieted to a drizzle, but something darker was building in his mind. He returned to Kimo's statement, comparing times and details. The pieces did not fit neatly anymore. 2 days later, television crews arrived at the shoreline. They filmed the ongoing search as Kimo stood near the edge of the sea, eyes cast downward, his face frozen in grief. He spoke softly to reporters, saying he only wanted his wife home, even if the ocean had taken her. Cameras flashed, and for a moment his image appeared sympathetic, a husband mourning in public. But Tanaka watched from the distance, arms crossed, and felt the same quiet unease. The scene looked rehearsed. Every word sounded like something said for an audience, not from the heart. Back at the station, Tanaka placed a photograph of the couple on his desk. Leilani's smile seemed full of light, while Kimo's expression beside her looked tight and distant. Tanaka whispered to himself that storms did not erase marriages, but secrets often did. The investigation that began as a search for a missing teacher was beginning to take a different shape. The rain might have washed away the tracks on the bridge, but the silence inside Kimo's story was louder than the thunder that had once covered his crime. And just when the case seemed to stall, a small discovery near the shoreline would twist everything further toward suspicion. Morning fog rolled across the shoreline as the search team gathered once again. The sea had calmed, but the air still smelled of stormwater and salt. Lieutenant Kaleo Tanaka stood near the tide line with his boots sinking into the wet sand. Officers moved slowly along the rocks, eyes scanning every inch of debris the storm had left behind. Each piece of driftwood, every scrap of fabric, could be the clue they needed. The case that began as a missing person was no longer just about a storm. Something in Tanaka's gut told him there was more. Around mid-morning, an officer shouted from the far end of the bay. In the sand, near a line of tangled seaweed, lay a beige women's shoe, half buried by the tide. The leather was soaked and discolored, but its size and design matched the pair Leilani was last seen wearing. Tanaka crouched beside it, his gloves brushing off sand carefully. He stared at the delicate pattern on the heel and imagined Leilani walking out of her house that morning, never knowing it would be her last. The shoe was sealed in a plastic evidence bag, tagged and logged. It was not proof of a crime, but it was a whisper from the past, carried in by the tide. That same afternoon, as officers questioned locals along the coast, an older fisherman approached them. His name was Jonas Kyo, a quiet man with weathered hands and sharp eyes. He told Tanaka that on the night before the storm, around 10 o'clock, he had seen a brown Toyota Corolla parked near Waiākea Bridge. A man and a woman were inside arguing. The next morning, just after sunrise, he saw what looked like the same car again, parked in the same spot, but this time the man was alone. The car was gone by mid-morning when the rain grew heavy. Tanaka's pulse quickened as he wrote the statement. A brown Corolla, the same model Leilani drove. He thanked Jonas, then looked toward the direction of the bridge. If the fisherman was right, that spot could hold everything they were missing. The next day, the search unit returned to the area with metal detectors and wading gear. They swept the shallow water near the bridge, hoping to locate signs of a submerged vehicle. The mud was thick and the current strong. Every metallic reading turned out to be a piece of debris or rusted scrap washed down by the storm. The team spent hours in knee-deep water until the sun fell behind the clouds again. Nothing. No car. No trace. Back at the station, Tanaka pinned new photos to the evidence board. The shoe, the bridge map. Jonas's signed statement. He drew red lines connecting the timeline, Leilani leaving home, the storm beginning, Kimo's version of events, and now the sighting of the Corolla. Each detail stretched the story wider, exposing cracks in Kimo's calm explanation. Tanaka replayed the interview in his mind. Kimo said he never left home that morning, yet the witness placed a man fitting his description by the bridge where tire tracks had vanished into the water. He said Leilani must have been swept away, yet her shoe appeared miles away from the current's flow. The pieces were starting to align, not by chance, but by intent. Someone had moved her. Someone had hidden her. And every clue pointed back to the same quiet man sitting in his small wooden house, pretending to mourn while the storm carried his secret. The investigation was no longer chasing waves or tides. It was chasing a lie. And the one thing still missing was the brown Corolla that had vanished with Leilani Akana. The search along the shoreline continued for weeks after the storm, but most days brought nothing except seaweed and silence. Then, one overcast morning, a fisherman hauling in his net near Hilo Bay felt something heavy caught deep within the tangled ropes. As he pulled it up, the dark water spilled over the edge of his small boat, revealing a soaked purse covered in sand and algae, wrapped tightly in the netting as if the sea itself had tried to hide it. When he turned the purse over, the faded initials L.A. were still visible on the strap. The fisherman froze for a moment before calling the Coast Guard, who then contacted the police. Within the hour, Lieutenant Kaleo Tanaka and his team arrived at the docks. The purse was laid gently on a clean tarp, and Tanaka could see the edges of paper sticking out through the zipper. He opened it carefully, his gloves damp with seawater. Inside, they found Leilani Akana's driver's license, her school ID, and a few folded notes in her handwriting. The ink had blurred, but one line remained readable. It said, "He gets angry when I leave the house without telling him." Another note mentioned fear that had grown over months. It was not written for anyone to find, but for herself, like a confession trapped in paper. At the bottom of the purse, an officer discovered a torn piece of cardboard. The writing on it was faint but clear enough to read. "Do not trust K." The letter stopped there, unfinished, as if she had been interrupted. The air around the dock seemed to grow heavier. Tanaka stared at the words for a long time, the sound of the waves fading in his mind. Back at the station, the evidence table filled with the items recovered from the purse. The chief examined each one silently before setting his glasses down. Until that moment, the case had been treated as a tragic disappearance caused by nature. But this was not a storm's work. This was human. The decision came that afternoon. The file was reclassified. The words "missing person" were crossed out in black ink and replaced with "presumed homicide." The new case title read, Case 80-112, Leilani Akana. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Officers spoke quietly. For the first time, they were not searching for a victim of a storm, but for a victim of someone close. Tanaka stood near the window, rain tapping softly against the glass once again. He thought about the argument the neighbor had reported, the calm face of Kimo during questioning, and the shoe that had washed ashore miles away. All the pieces were beginning to move toward the same direction. He looked down at the purse sealed in its evidence bag, the words, "Do not trust K," echoing in his mind. The message was clear, and yet it had come too late to save her. Somewhere beneath that calm and silent sea, something else was waiting to be found. Something that would tell the truth of what really happened on that stormy morning in 1980. The discovery of Leilani's purse changed everything. For the first time, the police no longer saw a storm's victim, but a silenced woman. With growing evidence and rising suspicion, Lieutenant Kaleo Tanaka prepared an affidavit for a full search of the Ana property. Within 2 days, a warrant was signed by the court. The morning they arrived, gray clouds still hung over the island. The house stood quiet, its yard soaked from days of rain. The wooden fence creaked as officers stepped through, their boots pressing into the wet soil. Tanaka led the team himself, his notebook in hand, his mind fixed on every detail he remembered from Kimo's statement. Inside the house, the air smelled sharply of disinfectant. Every surface looked spotless, almost unnaturally clean. Tanaka walked into the garage and paused. The cement floor looked newer than the rest of the structure. Smooth, bright, without cracks. He knelt down, brushing his hand across it, feeling the faint difference in texture. The report from neighbors said that Kimo had done some late-night work there a few days after the storm. Fresh cement where there should have been old cracks. It was not proof, but it was not right either. Behind the house, another officer called out. Near the chicken coop, a patch of soil appeared freshly turned. The rest of the ground was firm, but that small section looked as if someone had dug and covered it again. Tanaka ordered the soil to be tested. They dug carefully, layer by layer, but found nothing beneath, only damp earth and the faint smell of bleach that should never have been there. Someone had tried to erase something. Throughout the day, the team searched every inch of the property, closets, sheds, crawl spaces, but nothing pointed to a body, no blood, no fibers, no car. It was as if Leilani had vanished into thin air. But Tanaka could feel it in his bones. She had been here once, and now the house itself seemed to hold its breath, unwilling to speak. With no forensic technology advanced enough to trace the faint chemical cleaning, and without a single physical tie, the investigation reached a painful halt. The media began to turn the story into nightly headlines. Storm tragedy or foul play? They asked. Crowds gathered outside the station. Some believed Kimo was guilty. Others saw him as a grieving husband being hunted by police. Under pressure, Kimo hired a lawyer who advised him to stop cooperating. As the months passed, public interest began to fade. The evidence was thin, the leads exhausted, and the courts demanded progress the department could not deliver. By December 1980, Chief Lawo had no choice but to suspend the investigation. Case 80-112 was officially marked cold. That winter, a small memorial service was held for Leilani Akana at Waiākea Beach. There was no coffin, only a framed photograph placed beside a white orchid wreath. Kimo stood at the front, hands clasped, eyes dry. When the ceremony ended, he turned away and left without a word. Within weeks, he sold the house and disappeared from Hilo. That night, after the service, Tanaka sat alone at his desk. He opened his notebook and wrote one final line beneath the fading ink of his last report. A crime is here, but the sea has covered it. He closed the book and stared at the rain falling outside. Knowing the storm had not buried the truth, it had only delayed it. And 40 years later, that same truth would rise again from the ground Kimo Ana thought would keep it silent forever. For 40 years, the Ana house stood quiet on the edge of Hilo. Seasons changed, owners came and went, But the ground beneath that old property never forgot what it was hiding. The neighborhood grew busier, new homes rose around it, and the memory of Leilani Akana slowly faded into a distant local ghost story. Case 80-112 became just another cold file buried deep in the archives. But the truth has a strange way of waiting for its time to rise. It was March 2020 when the silence finally broke. A construction crew was sent to demolish the abandoned Ana property. The house had decayed over the years, its walls eaten by termites and its windows covered in dust. On the second day of work, as one of the workers struck the concrete foundation of the old backyard shed, his hammer hit something hollow beneath the slab. The sound echoed differently, metallic and deep. They dug further, clearing away pieces of broken cement, until a rusted metal box appeared beneath the dirt. The box was sealed shut with corroded clasps, the edges eaten by time. When the foreman pried it open, a faint smell of rust and sea air escaped, like something that had waited far too long. Inside, wrapped in layers of decayed cloth, were objects that did not belong to any tool shed. A pearl necklace, dull but still elegant, engraved with the initials L.A., a stack of medical papers dated 1979, signed in Leilani's name, and at the bottom, a Polaroid photograph, faded but unmistakable. It showed a young woman smiling beside a man in a security uniform. Behind them, the waves of Hilo Bay glimmered faintly in the sun. The man was Kimo Ana. Police were immediately called to the site. Within hours, the rusted box and its contents were transported to the Honolulu Police Department's cold case unit. The case was reopened after 4 decades of silence. Leading the investigation was Lieutenant Ava Kimura, a determined investigator known for breathing life into cases others had forgotten. When she read the name on the report, she paused for a long time. Leilani Akana. It was a name that carried a chill even after all these years. Ava spent nights reviewing the original case files, scanned notes, water-damaged photos, and the old handwriting of officers long retired. One name stood out among them all: Lieutenant Kaleo Tanaka, the man who had refused to let go of the belief that the sea was not to blame. She found him living quietly in Hilo, now an old man with a slow step but sharp eyes that still held the weight of unfinished duty. When Ava met him, she placed the photograph on the table in front of him. For a moment, Tanaka said nothing. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at the faces frozen in time. Then he spoke softly. He said that the ocean did not take her. A person did. And now, after 40 long years, that person's secret had begun to surface once again. Beneath that old soil, the storm's silence had finally cracked, and what it would reveal next would pull everyone back into the shadows of that long-forgotten crime. When the cold case unit officially reopened the file of Leilani Akana, it felt like breathing life into a ghost. The folder was thin, its papers brittle and yellowed, but what caught Lieutenant Ava Kimura's attention most was what was missing. She sat in the dim light of her office, flipping through each report from August 1980. Some pages were incomplete, others poorly scanned, and several early witness logs were gone entirely, especially those dated between August 13th and 16th, the crucial days right after the storm. It was as if pieces of the investigation had vanished along with Leilani herself. Ava leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Reports did not simply disappear unless someone wanted them to. She began listing every detail still preserved: tire tracks near the bridge, the missing car, the shoe, the purse, the torn message that said, "Do not trust K." But there was one detail from the new discovery that haunted her most: the metal box buried under the shed, placed there intentionally, sealed to last decades. She needed insight from someone who had seen the case before time had buried it. So she drove to Hilo, the same island where it all began. When she arrived at a quiet coastal neighborhood, Kaleo Tanaka was waiting on his porch, older but still sharp-eyed, a man who had carried a question in his heart for 40 years. They sat together at a small table overlooking the gray sea. Eva placed the photo and the necklace from the box in front of him. For a long moment, Tanaka said nothing. Then he opened an old leather notebook, its pages worn from decades of handling. Inside were his personal notes, details never typed into any report. He had written about the new cement in the garage floor, how it had appeared only days after Leilani disappeared. He had written about the freshly turned soil behind the chicken coop and the smell of bleach in the dirt. He had always believed something was hidden there, but technology at the time could not prove it. As Eva read through his notes, her determination grew. She looked up at Tanaka and said that it was time to finish what he had started. The storm may have washed away tracks and traces, but science had advanced far beyond what it was in 1980. For the first time, they could search not only with shovels but with truth that left no place to hide. The next morning, Eva presented her findings to the department's legal division and secured a new warrant. The goal was clear: to excavate the Akana property, piece by piece from the garage foundation to the chicken coop where the soil had once been disturbed. The warrant was signed without hesitation. By late March 2020, equipment and forensic teams gathered at the old property. Bright yellow tape fluttered against the wind as officers marked the perimeter. The sound of shovels scraping against the earth echoed through the yard. For the first time in 4 decades, the ground that had kept its silence was being broken again. Each layer of soil uncovered not just dirt, but the weight of everything that had been hidden beneath it. And before long, the earth itself would begin to speak. As the excavation team worked carefully at the old Akana property, the items recovered from the metal box were sent straight to the forensic laboratory in Honolulu. Each object was handled like a fragile memory, photographed, logged, and sealed for testing. But the most significant piece of evidence was the pearl necklace engraved with the initials L. A. The same necklace Leilani was last seen wearing in 1980. Under the microscope, a technician noticed something nearly invisible caught between 2 of the pearls. A single strand of hair, thin and preserved from decades of being sealed inside the box. It was delicate, but the root was still attached, which meant DNA could be extracted. That single hair might carry the identity of whoever had touched or worn the necklace before it was buried. The sample was sent to the modern DNA laboratory at the State Crime Unit. There, forensic experts used polymerase chain reaction testing, known as PCR, a technology that did not exist in 1980. With it, they could copy and read genetic material from even the smallest trace of evidence. Days passed as the machines processed the strand, amplifying the DNA millions of times until a clear profile appeared on the screen. When the results came back, everyone in the lab froze. The DNA was male, not female. That meant the hair did not belong to Leilani. It belonged to someone else, someone who had handled or worn the necklace before it was locked away. The next step was clear. The team compared the new DNA profile with archived state medical records, searching for any potential match. The database returned a result within hours. The DNA belonged to Kimo Ana, matched from a hospital blood sample taken in 1995 after a workplace injury. The probability of error was so small it was nearly impossible to deny. The strand of hair found on Leilani's necklace carried Kimo's genetic signature. Lieutenant Eva Kimura stared at the report in silence. For 40 years there had been suspicion but no proof, no direct link tying Kimo to the disappearance. But now, science had done what time could not. That necklace, hidden and buried beneath his own property, carried his DNA. When Eva called Kaleo Tanaka to tell him the results, his voice trembled with something between sorrow and relief. He had spent decades believing that the ocean was not to blame, and now the truth had finally surfaced. The chain of evidence was no longer a theory. It was a living connection between Leilani and the man who swore she was lost to the storm, and as the ground at the Akana property continued to be carefully uncovered, something else was waiting just below the surface. something that would turn this cold case into undeniable truth. The sun had barely risen when the forensic excavation team arrived at the old Akana property. The morning air was still, carrying only the faint sound of waves in the distance. The ground, damp from overnight rain, seemed to hold its breath as bright yellow cables and sensors were laid out across the backyard. For the first time in 40 years, the soil that Kimo Ana once walked upon was about to give up its secret. The team began with a ground-penetrating radar survey, a technology that could scan deep beneath the surface without turning a single spade of dirt. Each slow pass of the machine sent signals below the earth, mapping hidden shapes that no eye could see. For long minutes, the screen showed nothing but streaks of gray lines, until one of the technicians stopped suddenly. About 4 feet deep, near the old chicken coop, the radar displayed a clear anomaly, a rectangular shape, uneven but solid. The outline was unmistakable. Something had been buried there a long time ago. The site was immediately marked, and Ava stood beside it, her heart pounding. Tanaka stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the ground he had once suspected. As the first shovel pierced the soil, the air grew heavy. Inch by inch, they dug through layers of compacted dirt, every movement careful, deliberate, silent. The smell of damp earth mixed with faint traces of something else, time and decay. Then one of the forensic experts called out softly. A fragment of fabric had appeared, faded blue and clinging to the soil. They continued to clear the area around it, brushing gently until the curve of bone emerged beneath. A hush fell over everyone. The remains were fragile, partly encased in hardened clay. The forensic pathologist worked slowly, uncovering the skeletal frame piece by piece until the outline of a human body lay before them. The measurements confirmed it belonged to a female in her late 20s, approximately 5'4", a perfect match for Leilani Akana. Ava stood motionless as Tanaka lowered his head, closing his eyes. After decades of doubt, the truth was finally visible, silent but undeniable. What they found next turned tragedy into certainty. The neck vertebrae showed damage, fractures consistent not with drowning or an accident, but with manual strangulation or ligature compression. This was not the work of a storm. This was deliberate. Ava felt a chill move through her as she looked at the hollow space in the ground. Leilani had been buried here all along, only a few feet from where her husband once lived his ordinary life. The storm had been his alibi, the weather his cover, and the silence his shield. But the earth had remembered everything. When the remains were lifted into evidence bags and taken toward the waiting van, Tanaka whispered the words he had written in his notebook decades earlier. "A crime is here, but the sea has not covered it." The case that had once been drowned in rumor was now reborn in truth. And as the investigation deepened, the final hours of Leilani Akana's life would soon be rebuilt, moment by moment, until the last lie of Kimo Ana began to unravel. The discovery of Leilani's remains changed everything. What had once been only suspicion was now undeniable proof of murder. But Lieutenant Ava Kimura knew that to bring justice after 40 years, the evidence needed to tell a complete story, one that showed not only what happened, but when it happened. Inside the cold case room, Ava spread the original reports and Tanaka's old notes across the long table. A digital clock ticked softly as she pieced together the fragments of that long-ago morning. Beside her sat Kaleo Tanaka, his hands clasped, eyes steady, as if he had waited his whole life to hear the timeline spoken aloud. At 6:40 a.m., Leilani Akana left her home on Waiākea Road. She was carrying her folder of art papers, wearing her beige raincoat and driving her brown Toyota Corolla. She told a neighbor she was heading to the school early to prepare for the day before the storm worsened. That was the last time anyone saw her alive on her own. At 7:10 a.m., a separate report showed Kimo's pickup truck leaving the house, but his route did not match the direction toward his workplace. Instead, witnesses recalled his truck turning down the coastal road toward Waiākea Bridge, the same area where Leilani's tire tracks had been found leading into the water. Ava paused, drawing 2 lines across the map, one showing Leilani's path, the other Kimo's. They converged near the bridge at 8:05 a.m. Fisherman Jonas Keogh had seen a brown Corolla parked at the edge of the bridge. He described a man and a woman inside arguing loudly. The woman's voice was strained, the man's movements tense. Moments later, the man stepped out, slammed the door, and the car remained there for several minutes before it disappeared completely. Tanaka nodded slowly as Ava read Jonas's statement aloud. That was the same morning, the same location, and the same car. Then, at 9 o'clock, the Kona storm struck full force. The sky turned black and sheets of rain erased everything. Roads flooded, communication lines went down, and visibility dropped to nothing. By then, Leilani was already gone. Ava looked up from the papers, her voice low but firm. The timeline did not just challenge Kimo's story, it destroyed it. He had told police that Leilani was swept away by the storm, but all the evidence proved she had vanished before the storm ever reached full strength. The storm was not the cause of her disappearance. It was the cover. Tanaka's jaw tightened as he stared at the photo of Leilani from 1980. For decades, Kimo had hidden behind a natural disaster, claiming the sea had taken his wife. But now, the timeline revealed what really happened. The storm did not take her life. It only hid the truth of her death, and while the past had finally begun to speak, one witness was still alive who could confirm exactly what he saw that morning and place Kimo Ana face-to-face with Leilani for the last time. With the timeline finally rebuilt, Lieutenant Ava Kimura knew there was still one more voice that needed to be heard, someone who had seen what the storm had tried to hide. The name written on the original 1980 report was Jonas Keogh, the fisherman who had been near Waiākea Bridge that morning. If he was still alive, his eyes might hold the last living memory of Leilani Akana before she vanished. Ava and Kaleo Tanaka drove along the coast that afternoon, past the same winding roads that Leilani had once taken toward the sea. The air smelled of salt and rain, and in the distance the old bridge stood quiet under a blanket of moss. Tanaka had not returned here in decades, and every turn of the wheel brought back the weight of the case he could never close. They found Jonas living in a small wooden house overlooking the harbor. He was older now, his skin weathered from years under the sun, his hands still strong though time had slowed them. When he saw Tanaka standing at his door, recognition flickered in his eyes. He smiled faintly and said that he always knew someone would come back one day asking about that storm. Inside his home, the sound of the ocean drifted through the open window as Ava laid out a folder on the table. She spoke gently, explaining why they were there, how the case had been reopened after the discovery at the Ana property. Jonas listened quietly, his gaze fixed on the faded photograph of the brown Toyota Corolla placed before him. When Ava asked what he remembered, Jonas closed his eyes for a moment, then began to speak. He said that, on the morning before the storm hit, he had stopped near Waiākea Bridge to secure his boat lines. The rain had not yet started, but the sky looked dark. That was when he saw the brown Corolla parked by the guardrail. Inside were a man and a woman. The woman looked tense, almost frightened. The man was talking fast, moving his hands, angry. He remembered the woman's hair, long and dark, and the man's build. Broad shoulders, short-sleeved shirt, hair slicked back. He had seen them arguing, then silence. When he returned later that morning to check the tide, the car was still there, but the woman was gone. The man stood alone beside the vehicle for a few minutes, then drove away toward the main road. Ava slowly slid a photograph of Kimo Ana across the table, one taken in the late 1970s. Jonas stared at it for a long while, his fingers trembling slightly. Then he nodded. His voice was firm, certain. That was the man by the bridge. He said he could never forget that face. Ava handed him a fresh statement form, and Jonas signed his name carefully at the bottom, his pen pressing deep into the paper as if carving the truth that had waited 40 years to be told. That signature placed Kimo with Leilani alive, moments before the storm, at the exact place where her tire tracks had ended. Tanaka exhaled slowly, his eyes glistening. After decades of silence, the witness had spoken again, and his words connected the last missing piece of the puzzle. The chain of evidence was now unbroken. The necklace, the DNA, the body, and the witness who had seen it all. And with that final confirmation, it was time for Ava to bring the man who had hidden behind the storm face to face with the truth he had buried. The walls of the interview room were plain, gray, and silent, the kind of silence that presses against the chest. On one side of the table sat Kimo Ana, now 72 years old, his hair silvered, his eyes still sharp but weary. On the other side sat Lieutenant Ava Kimura and retired investigator Kaleo Tanaka, the man who had once chased this very truth when the world still believed it was only a storm. For the first few minutes, no one spoke. Ava placed a folder on the table, her movements calm but deliberate. Then she looked directly at him. She began with the smallest piece, the pearl necklace. She slid it across the table toward him, sealed carefully in a transparent bag. The necklace that had been buried under his own shed. His eyes followed it slowly, but his expression did not change. He said it looked familiar, but it could have belonged to anyone. Ava did not respond. Instead, she opened another folder. Inside was the DNA report. It carried the evidence he could not deny. The hair found tangled between the pearls, tested and matched to his blood sample from 1995. The numbers printed on that page were precise, scientific, final. The odds of it belonging to anyone else were 1 in several billion. Kimo leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, and for the first time, his breathing deepened. He tried to speak evenly, repeating the same story he had told in 1980, that the storm had taken Leilani, that she had driven out in the rain and never come back. He said the sea was merciless that day, but the more he spoke, the more the calm in his voice began to waver. Ava let him finish before placing the photograph of Waiākea Bridge in front of him. The image was old and grainy, taken decades ago, but next to it was a recent signed witness statement, the one from Jonas Keo. It clearly stated that he had seen Kimo standing by the brown Corolla that morning, arguing with Leilani before she vanished. The air in the room shifted. Kimo's shoulders stiffened. His hands began to tremble slightly against the tabletop. Ava's voice remained steady as she said that the storm did not take his wife. He did. For a long time, Kimo said nothing. His eyes darted toward the wall, his jaw tightening. Then, almost under his breath, he muttered that Leilani had wanted to leave. She wanted to take the children and go to her sister's house. She had planned to start over, to live without him. His voice cracked as he said those words, his fingers gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Tanaka watched silently. For the first time in 40 years, the calm mask Kimo wore was breaking. The story of the storm was falling apart, replaced by something raw and human, jealousy, control, and fear of losing her. Ava leaned forward, her voice low. She told him that the storm may have washed away tracks and cars, but not the truth. The evidence had survived. The necklace, the DNA, the witness, the remains, all of it led back to him. Kimo did not answer. He only looked down at the necklace again, his reflection faint in the glass. For the first time, the man who once stood untouchable in his lies began to look small beneath the weight of what he had done. And while his silence filled the room, Ava knew they were closer than ever to breaking through completely, because the truth that hides for 40 years can only stay buried for so long before it demands to be confessed. Kimo's silence after questioning was more than guilt, it was a map, His few broken words about Leilani leaving gave Ava something tangible to trace. She returned to Jonas Keogh's statement, reading carefully through every detail. Jonas had mentioned something years ago that investigators had missed: a side branch of the Waiākea stream, a narrow flooded cut that joined the main current just south of Waiākea Bridge. He said the area was difficult to access, and during storms it filled completely, hiding anything beneath the surface. Ava stood at the edge of that very stream days later, boots sinking into soft mud. The water was dark and still, the surface broken only by slow ripples from passing wind. She looked toward Tanaka, who stood beside her. He had been here before, decades ago, when they searched with flashlights and ropes and found nothing. But this time they had sonar scanners, divers, and experience that came with 40 years of unanswered questions. The dive team entered the murky water carefully, their searchlights glowing faintly beneath the surface. For the first hour they found only debris, metal scraps, branches, and pieces of storm runoff. Then a diver's voice crackled over the radio. He had found something solid, half buried in the silt. When the crane lifted the object from the water, mud poured from the sides like dark rain. The shape was unmistakable: a rusted brown Toyota Corolla, its frame corroded but intact enough to read the faded registration plate. It matched Leilani Akana's vehicle, the same car that had disappeared the morning she vanished. As the car was placed onto the recovery tarp, forensic technicians surrounded it, cameras flashing. The smell of rust and river water filled the air as the trunk was carefully forced open. Inside lay a length of rope, stiffened with age, coiled like it had been thrown in hastily. Next to it was a piece of torn blue fabric, the same shade as the remnants found with Leilani's body during excavation. And there, resting in the corner of the trunk, was a single pearl earring, small, delicate, and perfectly matching the necklace recovered from the buried box. Ava watched silently as the items were bagged and sealed. The evidence was strong, but she wanted proof that would tie everything to the Anna property. When the forensic lab returned results days later, the connection was undeniable. Soil particles found inside the car's trunk matched the chemical and mineral composition of the soil behind Kemo's backyard chicken coop. The meaning was clear. The car had been used in the crime. It had carried Leilani's body from the house to the burial site before being dumped in the stream to vanish beneath the stormwater. As Ava read the lab report under the dim light of her office, she realized that every piece of Kemo's story had finally collapsed. The sea had not stolen his wife. He had. The storm had not hidden her body. He buried it himself, then sank the car to erase his trail. The last physical evidence had surfaced, and now nothing could protect him from the truth. And when Ava looked at the photograph of the rusted car, she knew the time had come to take back what the storm had stolen from justice. The case file on Leilani Akana had once been thin, just a few pages filled with questions. Now, 4 decades later, it was thick with truth. The DNA, the buried remains, the eyewitness confirmation, and the recovered car had formed a chain that could no longer be broken. Each piece of evidence led back to one man. Inside the prosecutor's office, Lieutenant Ava Kimura laid out the evidence across the conference table. Each photograph, each report, each detail that tied Kemo Anna to the murder he had buried beneath time. The air was heavy with quiet anticipation as the prosecutor read through the documents. When he finally looked up, his words were brief but powerful. The evidence was conclusive. He signed the motion and pushed it across the table. Within hours, a judge issued the official arrest warrant for first-degree murder, marking the end of 40 years of silence. Ava held the paper in her hands, its black ink still drying, feeling the weight of every life that had been touched by this case. The officers who never gave up, the witness who spoke after decades, and the woman whose voice had been stolen by violence. That evening, as the sun fell behind the mountains, SWAT units and Honolulu police officers gathered outside a quiet suburban home where Kimo had been living under a new address. The neighborhood was still, unaware of the history about to unfold on its street. A soft breeze moved through the palm leaves as the team surrounded the property. When they knocked on the door, Kimo appeared calm. His hair was gray, his body frail, but his face showed no surprise. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, the truth finally catching up after running for a lifetime. He raised his hands without resistance. His voice was steady as he told the officers that he understood. There was no argument, no denial, only silence. Ava stood at a distance as Kimo was led out in handcuffs, the light from the police cars flashing red and blue across his face. The man who had once smiled for cameras as a grieving husband now looked smaller beneath those lights, swallowed by the weight of his own lies. From across the street, Kaleo Tanaka watched quietly. His eyes reflected years of frustration, heartbreak, and persistence. For 40 years, he had carried a single line in his notebook. A crime is here, but the sea has covered it. Now, standing on that dim street, he whispered to himself that the sea had finally returned what it owed. As Kimo was placed into the back of the patrol car, Ava closed her case folder slowly. The storm that had once taken a woman and left only questions had now brought justice full circle. But even as the door of the police car shut behind Kimo, she knew the story was not over, because the truth of why he had done it, and the confession that would follow, was still waiting to be spoken. The arrest of Kimo Ana brought justice into motion, but for Lieutenant Ava Kimura, one question still burned quietly beneath all the evidence. Why? Why would a man take the life of his wife, the woman he once promised to protect? What could drive him to commit something so cold, then hide it for 40 long years? In the days following the arrest, Ava began to trace the story not through evidence this time, but through the history of their marriage. She spent hours digging through old family court records stored in the Honolulu archives, the paper edges yellow and brittle from age, and there, among a stack of faded files, she found something that made her chest tighten. Leilani Akana had tried to file for divorce more than once. The first petition was dated just months before her disappearance. It never reached completion, listed only as withdrawn. The second attempt, a draft never filed, was found among her old school papers, handwritten in careful script. In it, Leilani had written that she feared her husband's temper and that he had become increasingly controlling. Ava continued her search and began contacting friends and former co-workers from Waiākea School. Many were elderly now, their voices softened with time, but their memories of Leilani were clear. They described her as kind and talented, but behind her gentle smile there was sadness. One friend recalled that Leilani had once confided in her about Kimo's anger, how he followed her to work, questioned her about every phone call, and grew furious if she stayed late. But the most chilling memory came from a woman named Marjorie Tua, who had been Leilani's closest friend. Marjorie told Ava that Leilani had come to her the week before the storm, frightened and desperate. She said that Kimo had told her, "If I cannot have you, nobody will ever find you." Those words had haunted Marjorie ever since, and now, decades later, they echoed like a prophecy finally fulfilled. Back at the station, Ava shared everything with the behavioral analysis team. Together, they studied the case through a modern lens of psychology. The conclusion was painful but clear. This was not an act of impulse or panic. It was a possessive killing, born from obsession and control. Kimo had viewed Leilani not as a partner, but as something that belonged to him. And when she tried to leave, he did exactly what controlling men throughout history have done. He took her freedom and then her life. The forensic report arrived soon after. The ligature marks on the cervical vertebrae found with Leilani's remains were analyzed again using advanced imaging. The pattern of compression and bone damage matched perfectly with the rope recovered from the trunk of her submerged car. It was not coincidence. It was the final confirmation that she had been strangled, the rope tightening around her neck as the storm outside grew louder. Ava closed the file slowly, her fingers pressing against the name on the cover. The story was no longer about a woman lost to a storm. It was about a woman trapped in silence, a victim of control disguised as love. And though Kimo Ana had lived free for 40 years, the truth had finally cornered him. But before the court could decide his fate, there was one final moment left, the moment when he would speak the words himself and reveal how he ended the life of the woman who had once called him husband. The interrogation room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. The walls were bare, the light dim but steady. Seated across the table was Kimo Ana, now in a prison jumpsuit, his hands resting heavily on the metal surface. Time had taken much from him, but not the look in his eyes. Still sharp, still guarded, still trying to control the story even now. Lieutenant Ava Kimura entered the room with a folder in her hand. She set it down carefully, opening it so the papers were neatly aligned. Across from her, Kaleo Tanaka sat in silence, watching the man he had hunted for 4 decades. This was the moment both had waited for, the moment where silence would either hold or finally break. Ava began to speak softly, her voice steady and calm. She laid out each piece of evidence like bricks in a wall. The pearl necklace found under his shed, the DNA that matched his blood sample, the car recovered from the stream, the rope, the soil, and the witness who saw him arguing with Leilani before the storm. She unfolded the timeline, hour by hour, showing exactly where he had been, what he had done, and how his story had never truly fit the truth. Kimo sat still for a long time, his gaze fixed on the table. His breathing grew slower, heavier. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. He said that Leilani had planned to leave him. That morning, he followed her as she drove out, wanting to stop her before she reached the school. He found her near the Waiākea Bridge where they argued inside the car. The storm was already building in the distance, thunder rolling far off over the sea. He said that she told him she was done living in fear, that she wanted to be free. He said something inside him snapped. In a burst of rage and desperation, he reached across the seat, his hands closing around her neck. He did not remember how long it lasted. When the silence finally came, she was gone. Afterward, panic took over. He drove back to their house under the early rain, her body in the car beside him. He dug behind the chicken coop, covering the ground with soil and bleach. Then, under cover of the storm, he poured fresh cement in the garage to hide any trace of what he had done inside. When the rain grew heavier, he drove the car to the stream, weighted it down, and left it to sink, taking the rope and earring with it. The storm raged above him as if trying to wash away his sin. Kimo's voice trembled for the first time as he said that he had lived with that image in his mind every day. The moment her eyes closed, the way the sound of rain drowned out everything else. He said he thought the sea had buried the truth for him, but the truth had waited. It had waited beneath his feet all those years. Ava sat quietly as he spoke, not interrupting. When he finished, she pushed the written statement across the table. Kimo looked at it for a moment, then took the pen with a slow, shaking hand. He signed his name at the bottom, his handwriting weak but clear. The recording ended with the sound of the pen scratching paper, a sound that carried the weight of 40 years of silence finally breaking. Tanaka closed his eyes as if releasing a breath he had been holding since 1980. The storm that had once been Kimo's cover was now the very thing that brought him down. And as the signed confession was placed into the evidence file, the case that had haunted a generation stood ready for its final judgment. The courtroom, where justice would finally speak for Leilani Akana. The courtroom in Hilo was filled with quiet tension that November morning. In 2021, reporters lined the back rows, cameras waited outside the courthouse doors, and members of the community, some who still remembered the storm of 1980, sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the trial that had taken 4 decades to reach. At the front, behind the defense table, sat Kimo Anna, older, thinner, his once steady hands trembling slightly. Across from him, Lieutenant Eva Kimura and retired officer Kaleo Tanaka took their seats among the witnesses. Between them lay 40 years of unanswered questions and one chance to finally give Leilani Akana her voice back. When the prosecutor began, the room grew still. He spoke clearly, walking the jury through each layer of evidence that had survived time and silence. He started with the DNA, the hair found on the pearl necklace that matched Kimo's blood sample beyond any doubt. Then came the bones, recovered from beneath the very soil of his own property, their fractures proving the cause of death was strangulation. Next, the prosecutor revealed the rope, recovered from the trunk of the rusted Toyota Corolla, its fibers matching the ligature marks on Leilani's neck. The car itself had been pulled from the bottom of Waiākea Stream, still holding traces of the same soil from Kimo's backyard. And then came the witness testimony from Jonas Kio, the fisherman who had seen Kimo and Leilani arguing by the bridge the morning she vanished. Finally, the lights dimmed and the court played the recorded confession. Kimo's voice filled the room, slow and heavy, admitting what he had done. Every word struck like a wave against stone. By the time it ended, no one in the room was breathing normally. Even the sound of the tape clicking off seemed loud. The defense stood to speak, painting Kimo as an old man haunted by a single tragic mistake. They argued that it was not planned, that it had been a moment of rage born out of fear and heartbreak. They asked the jury for mercy, but the prosecution's closing words cut through the quiet like a blade. They said this was not tragedy, it was control. It was a man who believed that if he could not own her, no one could. It was a decision, not an accident. It was the act of possession disguised as love. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was read aloud, guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence followed soon after, 30 years in prison without the possibility of early parole. Kimo sat silently as the judge spoke. There was no visible reaction, no tears, no protest, only a slow lowering of his head. For him, the silence that had once protected him had finally turned into his cage. In the gallery, an older woman wiped her eyes. It was Leilani's daughter, now in her 40s, who had grown up with only stories of a mother she barely remembered. As she watched the man who had taken her mother's life led away in handcuffs, she whispered a quiet thank you to the officers who never gave up and to the mother whose memory had finally found peace. At the back of the courtroom, Tanaka stood still, his hat in his hands. For 40 years he had written and rewritten the same unfinished story, waiting for a final line that could close it. And that day, justice wrote it for him. Eva Kimura stepped outside into the light, the sound of the ocean faint in the distance. She looked up at the horizon and whispered that the storm was finally over. But her voice carried a quiet reminder. Justice had come. Yes, but so had a lesson about silence, control, and the cost of love turned into possession. And the message that followed would echo far beyond the courtroom walls, reaching every listener who had ever wondered how a storm could hide the truth for so long. The story of Leilani Akana ends not with thunder or storm, but with silence. The kind of silence that follows truth after years of waiting to be heard. A silence that is not empty but filled with meaning, with memory, with justice finally served. 40 years ago, a woman's voice was lost beneath fear and control. A woman who tried to leave, who tried to be free, and who paid the ultimate price for it. Leilani's story is not only about one murder. It is about every voice that was silenced behind closed doors. Every cry that went unheard because the system was too slow, too blind, or too indifferent to protect them. Back in 1980, When Leilani tried to file for divorce, there were no protective laws strong enough to shield her. Back then, a woman's fear was often dismissed as exaggeration, her bruises excused as accidents, her silence mistaken for peace. The system failed her the moment it chose not to listen. And that failure stretched across decades until people like Ava Kimura and Kaleo Tanaka refused to let it fade. This case became a lesson carved into history, a reminder that justice never sleeps. Science advanced, truth endured, and perseverance brought light to a darkness that time had tried to hide. It took modern forensics, human courage, and unbreakable persistence to bring Leilani back from the shadows. And through that effort, a message was born. No secret stays buried forever. Leilani's daughter grew up without her mother, but she stood in the courtroom when justice was spoken. That moment did not erase the pain, but it gave meaning to it. It showed that even after years of silence, truth still finds a voice. So, when you hear stories like this, remember Leilani. Remember that control is not love, silence is not peace, and fear should never be mistaken for loyalty. Remember that somewhere out there, someone still waits for the truth to be heard. And if you are still watching this story till now, it means this story deserves your like and your support. Please subscribe to Unscripted Tales and turn on the bell icon so you never miss another story like this one. Let us reach 5,000 likes on this video because that is the target set by my mother for you all. It is completely free, but means the world to us. Tell me from which city you are watching this cold case story. And remember, justice may take time, but it always finds its way home.